One of the amazing things I think that when we do start to settle is as you stop opposing yourself, then your mind does tend to settle down. It does tend to settle down. Like I said, the state of our mind shows us quite clearly our relationship with ourself, with our experience. So when we stop having an adversarial relationship with our experience, it starts to really calm down. And we can see clear, It's like taking a bottle of muddied water and finally just putting it down, and you just watch the sediment, make its way to the bottom, and the bottle becomes clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer. And it's been used for a long time as a metaphor for the meditative state of mind. When we start to come into a clearer state of being, I think one of the things that we often miss, because we're often secretly looking for something, and so we miss some of the most vital elements, is we miss that this burdensome sort of self is, as your mind settles and your body settles, this burden, the voice of this burdensome self starts to settle. It may actually cease altogether. It might cease for moments or longer. And one of the things we miss when those things happen, because, by the way, this happens to all of you every day. Even if you're not meditating, you are forgetting yourself with more consistency than you might imagine. You involve yourself in a task to the extent that you're not thinking about yourself. Well, you've kind of forgotten yourself to some extent, right? So it's not that forgetting ourselves is a rare thing to do. What's more rare is to sort of not forget oneself by being immersed in something so incredibly thoroughly that you lose your sense of self or separation. That's a wonderful thing. But you start to see that when the narration isn't there, that your experience is very, very different. And it's like you can watch this sort of self like the old trick birthday candles. It can arise, it can seem to disappear for a moment or longer, and then it arises and it disappears, and it arises and it disappears, and arises and disappears. Well, if it can disappear and you're noticing that it disappears, then it can't really be fundamentally you. And that's the part I think that we can easily miss. Like, hey, if my whole idea of myself just disappeared there for a moment, how real is it? Because it disappeared, but something about me seemed to be here, seemed to notice that it was disappearing. What is that? So this is when the known self starts to calm itself down, right? So you can do that through meditation, you can do that through different kinds of observation practices, like different kinds of inquiry. You can do that. So if you can see it, taste it, touch it, think about it, imagine it in any way whatsoever, Merton would call that the known self, right? If you can know it in any way whatsoever, that's what he's calling the known self. That's what I call the false self. Not false in the sense of being a judgmental about it. I don't mean it in that sense. I don't mean something negative, although false self has some pretty negative consequences in people's life. I mean false just in the sense of, well, not really completely real. False as in not true. And if we're paying attention, it really doesn't take too much before we start to see. In fact, I imagine most of the people that are in this room have had moments where, well, certainly where life was experienced a bit differently. You could see many, many different things. You can have little different insights or different experiences. But mostly, the kind of moments that get people to do something like this are moments where something occurred outside of what they imagined the sort of the consensus reality. And something breaks through that. Before you know it, you're on a spiritual search. You may have no memory of the event, because those events can happen literally in seconds. They don't have to be big events at all, but they can radically alter a life. So this unknown self. By the way, this was also one of the observations, I think. It can be much more complex than this, but to kind of boil it down into something less complex, what I'm talking about too is something that the Buddha was, I think, seeing when he was seen through self, seeing that self was just a composite of for the most part, not limited to this, but for the most part, a composite of rapidly moving thoughts, ideas, images, and their somatic counterparts in your body, right? Kind of flicking on and off as fast as thoughts come and go, right? But if they flicker almost continuously, then you have the sense of that it's continuously you. So when we begin to doubt the validity of that self, and to doubt the validity does not mean to judge it. See, if you're judging it heavily, you're still a little too caught up in it, right? If you're labeling it as terrible or bad or whatever, it's a little bit too caught up. It's unnecessary. But what's left underneath that? What's there when you start to see that, say 95%, just not to be too threatening. I mean, we could go to 100, but we'll just start with 95% of everything you thought you were, the way you thought about yourself, imagined yourself, really was just a bunch of conditioned nonsense. That's just a bunch of conditioned thoughts and ideas and beliefs and reactions and conditioned impulses and all the rest. That all this sort of coming together, literally all these disparate parts coming together for a moment, gave the sense like, oh, this is me. And one of the Buddha's fundamental insights, I think the fundamental insight that he actually had, was to look at that really, really deeply. So to look at it, he couldn't have been running from it. He couldn't have been trying to meditate it out of existence. The way he describes some of this in the sutras, it's very clear that he was taking a very, very profound and deep look. He was contemplating the very nature of self itself, right? He wasn't trying to get rid of it or avoid it or fix it or make it happier or anything. He was finally going, well, what is this thing that I seem to be basing my whole life on? And he came to see that it was, well, much more ephemeral than he had imagined it to be. And actually it doesn't take, to see it at the depth that he was seeing it, now that's a deeper matter, but to start to see this is not really that difficult to do. I'm sure many of you have started to see this, and some have at least had a suspicion, right, that there's. But the unknown, what's the unknown self? Now when Merton uses the term like an unknown self, he's teetering on a sort of poetic line of balance, right? Because is an unknown self a self at all, right? You could describe it in lots of different ways, but he's trying to give voice, and this is what I appreciate. I appreciate people that can give clear articulation to experiences that are often trans-rational, and fundamentally non-conceptual. So anybody that can articulate that well, that can translate it into concepts and can do that really well, I'm always a great fan of. He was one of them. So when he's using this idea of an unknown self, basically it's a way of saying, hey, did you notice that everything you think about yourself, you feel about yourself, you imagine about yourself, it can all disappear, whether it's for 30 seconds or for 30 days or what, it can all disappear, but somehow you, whatever you is, seems to be there. But whatever is there, noticing that the false disappearing as the false or seeing the false as a false, whatever it is that notices that can't be seen. Right? It's not a thought. It's not an image. It's not an idea. You can't see it like you can see anything else. In fact, it's really even difficult to think about it because it's essentially non-conceptual. So Merton is trying to give language to that. What is that? Right? And everybody there's a sort of common intuition throughout the human experience that, every time you think about your history, right? You'll tell somebody about what you did yesterday, or maybe it was when you were 10 years old even. But when you talk about the history in this way, it seems as though there is some continuity, right, between the past moment you're describing and the present moment. And what is it that links those two? And when you start to see that the self-idea, the self-concept, the self-image isn't what links it, because that can disappear for moments or hours or days. I'm sure there's a lot of meditators hoping that it disappears permanently, and maybe it will, who knows, but but when that happens, you're still there, whatever you are. You're there noticing that something you formerly thought you were just passed out of your conscious mind. And so, in this quote, Merton is giving expression to that by calling it an unknown self. You can't know it in any of the usual ways that we think about knowing. Now, if you want to get really confused, then you can dump into how did people talk about that kind of knowing. And actually, in the Christian mystical tradition, there were some people, including Merton himself, and one of my favorites, Meister Eckhart, that talked about unknowing knowledge. And that just makes people's heads spin. Like, what could unknown knowledge be? Well, it simply means that there's a way that something is recognized. Something is recognized. And that in itself is a feat. When you recognize something, there's something real about recognizing anything. So something is recognized, but at that level of depth, you can't know what it is you've recognized it. That's a pretty weird thing. You can recognize something but not know what it is you've recognized. Because essentially, you're at the point of your consciousness where you can't get apart from it and get a look at it. And to say, well, it's like this, or it's like that, or it's like that, or it's like that, or it's like that. If you can't get apart from something, you can recognize it, but not in any conventional sense. And I think when people hear terms like true self or my true being or a lot of these different ways, we tend to look for those, what we think those words and descriptions represent, we tend to look for them like we would look for anything else. And yet, what those words are actually trying to describe or articulate is not something that can be known in a conventional sense. If this sounds confusing to you, we'll just use an example that's immediately at hand. Your own awareness, say. Or consciousness, whatever word you like. It's operating right now. Fortunately, it's like your heartbeat. It works even when you aren't trying to make it work. You know what I mean? It doesn't need intention. We can apply intention to awareness, which is often done to varying degrees in meditation. But awareness is actually functioning in any conscious moment. Awareness is functioning. Okay, so awareness is there for all of us in this room. Now, what is it? Usually you'll just get a definite, awareness is awareness. As if we actually said anything, right? What do we know? Okay, what can I know awareness in the way I can know a bottle in front of me, or this cup, or your hand, or your shirt, well, clearly you can't know it in that way. You can't find it in that way. You can't even close your eyes and you can search for awareness as some sort of inner, subtle, esoteric experience, but you'll actually never find it. Because awareness is that which is watching you search for this esoteric little experience called awareness, right? It's sort of the light that makes all that even possible or experienceable. And so, just your ordinary garden variety awareness is known in the sense of I know it's happening. But it doesn't necessarily, what is it? I don't know really what it is. Right? So it's a kind of unknowing knowledge. There's a knowledge to it, but you don't really know a whole lot much about it beyond that. Right? Or, I'm sure a neurologist could talk to us quite in depth about awareness or consciousness, but I know if you push a neurologist to the very push them into a corner, they'll kind of throw their hands up and go, we don't know what consciousness is, really. We know what it does, it affects this and it affects that. We kind of know how it behaves and in some ways, and they're still trying to figure all that out. But what it actually is a total mystery, actually. Like I said, you can know how it behaves, but you can't quite get apart from it.